On the morning of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts arrived home in Frederick, Colorado after a business trip. Her friend Nicole Atkinson had dropped her off at her house around 2 in the morning. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with her third child, a boy she and her husband Chris had decided to name Nico. She was tired from traveling, but looking forward to seeing her daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. She had no way of knowing she had less than 3 hours to live. By noon that same day, Shanann was reported missing. Her friend Nicole had become alarmed when Shanann missed a scheduled doctor's appointment and wasn't responding to texts or calls. Nicole went to the Watts home and found it locked with no one answering. She could see Shanann's car in the garage through a window. Something felt wrong. Nicole called the Frederick Police Department, and officers arrived to conduct a welfare check. Before we continue with tonight's story, if you're finding this documentary interesting, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps us create more carefully researched content like this. We'd also love to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment below. Chris Watts arrived home while police were still at the house. He was a field technician for an oil company, working at remote well sites in the area. He seemed cooperative, but oddly calm given that his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters were missing. He told officers that Shanann had come home early that morning after her trip. He said they'd had an emotional conversation about separating, and when he left for work around 5 in the morning, she and the girls were still there. When he came home for lunch, they were gone. The story seemed plausible at first, marital problems, an upset wife taking the kids and leaving. But small details didn't fit. Shanann's purse, keys, and phone were still in the house. Her car was in the garage. She had an important doctor's appointment scheduled that she would never have missed. Friends who knew Shanann well said she would never just disappear, especially not while pregnant. The police began to suspect something more sinister had occurred. Chris Watts was 33 years old, originally from North Carolina. He had met Shanann in 2010 while both were working for the same automotive company. Shanann was outgoing and vivacious, while Chris was quiet and reserved. Friends described him as nice but somewhat passive, the kind of man who seemed to go along with whatever his wife wanted. They married in 2012 and moved to Colorado for work opportunities. Their life in Frederick appeared picture perfect from the outside. Shanann was active on social media, frequently posting about her family. She shared photos of Chris and the girls, videos of family activities, updates about her pregnancy. She worked as a promoter for a health and wellness company, often posting about products and her lifestyle. The family lived in a new subdivision, a modest but nice home on a cul-de-sac where other young families were raising children. Bella and Celeste, whom the family called Cece, were beautiful little girls with long dark hair and bright smiles. Shanann posted videos of them playing, singing, dancing. She shared moments from their daily lives, creating a digital scrapbook of their childhood. Chris appeared in many of these posts, though he was often quiet, smiling but not saying much. He seemed to be playing the role of devoted husband and father. But beneath this carefully curated image, the marriage was struggling. Financial stress had been building for years. The Watts family lived beyond their means, with significant credit card debt and a mortgage they could barely afford. They had filed for bankruptcy in 2015. Shanann's income from her sales work was inconsistent. Chris made a decent salary, but it wasn't enough to support their lifestyle. The pressure was constant and corrosive. In the summer of 2018, the cracks in the marriage widened. Chris had begun an affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. She was younger, single, and had no children. Chris told her he was separated from his wife and in the process of getting divorced. Nicole believed him, unaware that Chris was still living with Shanann and their daughters, still sleeping in the same bed, still presenting himself as a family man to the outside world. Chris became obsessed with Nicole. He texted her constantly, called her during his lunch breaks, made plans for a future together. He told her he wanted to be with her, that he was going to leave his wife. He seemed like a man infatuated, consumed by this new relationship. To Nicole, Chris appeared to be someone finally breaking free from an unhappy marriage. She had no idea what he was actually planning. Shanann sensed something was wrong. Chris had grown distant and cold. He no longer wanted to touch her or be intimate. When she tried to discuss their problems, he shut down or became defensive. She confided in friends that she was worried Chris was having an affair. She sent him heartfelt text messages asking what was wrong, trying to save their marriage. His responses were brief and dismissive. In early August, Shanann took the girls to North Carolina for a 6-week visit with her family. It was meant to be a break, a chance to give Chris space and for her to clear her head. While she was gone, Chris and Nickel spent more time together. They went on dates, slept together at his house, made plans. Chris told Nickel he felt free and happy. He seemed to be imagining a life without the responsibilities he had back home. But Shanann was coming back. Her business trip to Arizona was a quick turnaround before returning to Colorado. Chris knew she would be home soon, knew they would have to face their problems. He had told Nickel the separation would be finalized soon, that he would be free to be with her. But none of that was true. Shanann had no intention of divorcing him. She wanted to work on their marriage, to keep their family together. On the evening of August 12th, Shanann was in Arizona with colleagues for a work conference. She seemed happy in the videos and photos from that day, excited about her business and the baby on the way. She had no idea what awaited her at home. Chris was texting Nickel, making plans to see her. He was living in two completely separate realities, and they were about to collide. Shanann's flight landed after midnight on August 13. Nickel Atkinson picked her up and drove her home, pulling into the driveway around 2 in the morning. They talked briefly in the car. Shanann mentioned she and Chris needed to talk about their relationship. She seemed tired and a bit worried, but not afraid. She had no reason to fear her husband. Nickel watched Shanann walk into her house and drive away. She was the last person besides Chris to see Shanann alive. What happened in the early morning hours of August 13 inside the Watts home would later be described by Chris himself, though his accounts would shift and change. The version he eventually settled on was this. He told Shanann he wanted a separation. She became upset. He said she went upstairs and strangled their daughters in their beds. He claimed he then strangled Shanann in a rage over what she had done to their children. This story was almost certainly a lie, designed to shift some blame to Shanann. The truth, piecing together evidence and later admissions, was far more cold-blooded. Chris had already decided to kill his family. He had been researching how to hide bodies. He had access to remote oil sites through his work, where he knew bodies could be disposed of without discovery. He had planned this at least to some degree. When Shanann came home that night, he was ready to execute that plan. Shanann went to bed exhausted from her trip. Chris smothered her with his hands while she slept. She fought back, according to the autopsy findings. There were defensive wounds. She scratched him. But Chris was stronger, and she was pregnant and tired. The struggle didn't last long. When Shanann was dead, Chris loaded her body into his truck. Then he went upstairs to where Bella and Cece were sleeping. 4-year-old Bella woke up while her father was killing her mother. She asked what was wrong with her mother. Chris told her Shanann was sick. He took Bella and Cece out to his truck, where their mother's body was already loaded. He drove them 45 minutes to a remote oil site where he worked. During this drive, Bella asked if the same thing that happened to her mother was going to happen to her. She knew. A 4-year-old child knew her father was going to kill her. At the oil site, Chris smothered Bella and Cece. He then stuffed their small bodies into oil tanks through 8-inch hatches. He had to squeeze them through these narrow openings, forcing their bodies inside. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave nearby. Then he drove back home, arriving around mid-morning. He cleaned up. He went about his day. He texted Shanann's phone pretending he didn't know where she was. When police arrived at the house that afternoon for the welfare check, Chris played the role of concerned husband. He claimed he had no idea where Shanann and the girls could be. He suggested maybe she had gone to a friend's house. He said they'd been having marital problems, so maybe she just needed space. The officers found his behavior odd but not necessarily suspicious. They asked if they could search the house, and Chris agreed. Inside, everything appeared normal. There were no signs of a struggle or violence. Shanann's belongings were there, which was strange if she had left voluntarily. But there was no obvious evidence of a crime. The police asked Chris if he would be willing to do a television interview to help find his family. He agreed, still confident he could maintain the deception. That interview would be his undoing. On the evening of August 13th, local news cameras came to the Watts home. Chris stood on his front porch and spoke about his missing wife and daughters. He was stilted and awkward, his affect completely flat. He said things like, "I hope she's somewhere safe," with no emotion in his voice. He pleaded for their return, but seemed to be reading from a script badly. To viewers watching, something was clearly wrong. This was not how an innocent man whose family was missing would behave. Behind the scenes, Nicole Atkinson was already telling police that Chris's story made no sense. Shanann would never leave without her phone or car. She would never miss her doctor's appointment. She was excited about the baby. Something terrible must have happened. Nicole's insistence pushed investigators to look more closely at Chris as a suspect, rather than as a worried husband. The police asked Chris to come to the station for further questioning on August 14th. He agreed, still believing he could talk his way out of suspicion. During the interview, detectives noticed his behavior was unusual. He seemed more concerned with his image than with finding his family. When they asked about his marriage, he downplayed their problems. When they asked if he was having an affair, he initially denied it, then admitted there was someone else when pressed. The detectives showed Chris photos from inside his house, pictures of Shanann's wedding ring on the nightstand, her phone on the counter. They asked why she would leave without these things. Chris had no good answer. They told him they knew he was lying about something. His body language betrayed him, nervous gestures, and inability to maintain eye contact. But he stuck to his story. He had no idea where his family was. While Chris was being questioned, other officers were searching his home more thoroughly and looking at his workplace. They obtained his phone records and saw messages with Nicole Kessinger. They discovered he had been having an affair for weeks. They found evidence that the marriage was in serious trouble. They also noticed he had been searching the internet for information about oil tanks and disposal of bodies. The circumstantial evidence was mounting rapidly. Neighbors had security cameras that captured activity outside the Watts home on the morning of August 13th. Police reviewed the footage and saw Chris loading items into his truck around 5 in the morning. The camera angle didn't show exactly what he was loading, but the timing matched when he claimed to have left for work. The video showed his truck sitting in the driveway for a considerable time, with activity around the back of the vehicle. Police asked Chris if they could search the oil site where he worked. He agreed, apparently still believing he had successfully hidden the bodies. On August 15th, investigators went to the remote location. Using cadaver dogs and careful searching, they found disturbed earth that led them to Shanann's shallow grave. Her body was barely covered, the grave hastily dug. Nearby were the oil tanks where Chris worked. When investigators opened them, they found the bodies of Bella and Cece submerged in crude oil. The medical examiner would later determine that all three had been smothered. Shanann showed signs of having fought for her life. Bella had bitten her tongue severely, likely during her murder. The autopsy findings were horrific. These were intimate murders, hands-on killings that required Chris to look at his victims while he ended their lives. This wasn't a crime of passion in a single moment. It was systematic execution of his entire family. Chris was arrested on August 15th and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. He appeared in court looking haggard and defeated. The confident facade from his television interview was gone. He was ordered held without bond. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his lies were falling apart under scrutiny. Initially, Chris maintained his innocence. His father hired a defense attorney who advised him to say nothing. But the pressure of what he had done seemed to weigh on him. He was isolated in jail, alone with his thoughts. The entire nation had turned against him. His face was everywhere, vilified as a monster. Within days of his arrest, he decided to confess, though the confession he gave was still filled with lies. On August 16, Chris confessed to killing Shanann, but claimed it was because she had murdered Bella and Cece. He said he had told her he wanted a separation, and in response, she had gone upstairs and strangled their daughters. He claimed he then killed her in a rage. This story was transparent fiction, contradicted by physical evidence and logic. Shanann's autopsy showed she died before the girls. The timeline made Chris's story impossible. But this confession, false as it was, gave prosecutors leverage. They could now prove Chris had committed the murders, even if they couldn't yet prove premeditation in the way Chris described. The district attorney approached Chris's defense team with a plea offer. If Chris would plead guilty to all charges and provide a complete truthful account of what happened, the death penalty would be taken off the table. He would receive life in prison without possibility of parole. Chris's parents wanted him to fight the charges and take his chances at trial. They believed or claimed to believe his story about Shanann killing the girls. But Chris's attorney knew the evidence was overwhelming and the death penalty was a real possibility if they went to trial. After consultation, Chris agreed to accept the plea deal. On November 6, 2018, he pleaded guilty to 9 felony counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing hearing on November 19, members of Shanann's family gave victim impact statements. Her father, Frank Rizusek, spoke about the girls, about how Bella loved school and Cece loved to laugh. He described Shanann's excitement about her pregnancy. He looked at Chris and said he forgave him, not because Chris deserved it, but because carrying hatred would destroy what was left of their family. It was a moment of grace that Chris did not deserve. Shanann's mother, Sandra, spoke about the pain of losing her daughter and granddaughters. She described the horror of knowing how they died, of imagining their fear. She said Chris had not only killed her family, but had also tried to destroy Shanann's reputation with his lies about her killing the children. She wanted the world to know that Shanann was a loving mother who would never have harmed her daughters. Chris was given 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for other charges. The judge made clear that Chris would die in prison. Chris made a brief statement apologizing to Shanann's family, but his words rang hollow. He was led away in shackles to begin his life sentence. He was transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, moved out of state for his own safety. In February 2019, Chris agreed to be interviewed by investigators again. This time he finally told the truth, or something closer to it. He admitted that he alone had killed all 3 victims. He described smothering Shanann in their bed. He admitted that Bella had woken up and asked what was wrong with her mother. He confessed to driving the girls to the oil site while they were still alive, knowing what he was going to do to them. The details Chris provided in this confession were chilling. He described how Bella had fought him when he tried to smother her. He said Cece had gone limp quickly, without much struggle. He explained how he had pushed their bodies through the 8-inch hatches of the oil tanks. He showed no emotion while recounting these acts. The detectives listening to him were horrified by his flat, detached manner of speaking about murdering his children. The question everyone asked was why. What would drive a man to kill his pregnant wife and 2 small daughters? Chris's answer was that he wanted to be with Nicole Kessinger and saw his family as an obstacle. He said he felt like he couldn't get divorced because of the financial implications and because Shanann wouldn't agree to it. He claimed he felt trapped and saw murder as his only way out. This explanation satisfied no one. Psychologists and criminal profilers who study the case offered various theories. Some suggested Chris was a family annihilator, a specific type of killer who murders his entire family to start a new life. Others pointed to his passive personality and suggested he had been building resentment for years, unable to express his feelings until they exploded in violence. Some speculated about narcissistic traits or antisocial personality disorder, but no diagnosis or theory can truly explain the horror of what Chris did. He smothered his pregnant wife while she slept. He then killed his 2 daughters, one of whom begged him to explain what was happening. He disposed of their bodies in oil and dirt. He then went home and pretended they had disappeared. He gave a television interview and lied to police. He tried to blame Shanann for the girls' deaths. Every choice he made after the murders showed consciousness of guilt and a desire to escape responsibility. Nicole Kessinger was questioned extensively by police. She cooperated fully, providing her phone and computer for analysis. She claimed she had no knowledge of Chris's plans or actions. She said she truly believed he was separated and in the process of divorcing. When she learned what he had done, she was horrified. She has since disappeared from public view, changing her name and trying to escape the association with this crime. The investigation revealed that Chris had been searching online for information about Nicole days before the murders. He had looked at her social media repeatedly. He had searched for wedding rings and new homes. He had been fantasizing about a future with her while still living with Shanann and the girls. This suggests the murders were motivated at least in part by his desire to start fresh with Nickel, unencumbered by his family. Shanann's social media presence, once a celebration of her family, became evidence in understanding what happened. Her posts from the weeks before her death showed a woman trying to save her marriage. She shared quotes about love and fighting for relationships. She posted pictures of Chris, trying to present a united front. Her final post from the night before she was killed showed her excitement about her pregnancy and hope for the future. The community of Frederick, Colorado, was devastated by the murders. This was a small town where people knew each other, where children played safely in subdivisions. The idea that a father could murder his family and hide their bodies at his workplace shattered the community's sense of security. Vigils were held for Shanann, Bella, and Cece. Neighbors who had waved to the Watts family at their doorstep struggled to comprehend what had happened. The Watts home became a place of horror in the neighborhood's collective memory. It was sold to pay off debts and creditors. The new owners had the house completely renovated, trying to erase the physical space where Shanann had died. But no amount of renovation could erase the knowledge of what had occurred there. The house would always be the place where the Watts family was destroyed. Shanann's family established a foundation in her memory and in honor of Bella and Cece. They wanted something positive to come from this tragedy. The foundation provided resources for families in crisis and supported programs for domestic violence prevention. It was a way to ensure that Shanann and her daughters would be remembered for who they were, not just as victims. The case received massive media attention. Documentaries were produced, podcasts dedicated episodes to analyzing every detail, and true crime enthusiasts dissected the case online. Some of this attention was respectful and aimed at understanding what happened. Other coverage felt exploitative, turning tragedy into entertainment. Shanann's family had to watch their private pain become public spectacle. Chris's parents maintained a complicated relationship with what happened. They initially seemed to believe Chris's lies about Shanann killing the girls. They made statements to the media that were critical of Shanann, suggesting she had been controlling and difficult. This caused additional pain to Shanann's family, who felt the Watts were trying to shift blame to the victim. The relationship between the two families was destroyed. Later, Chris's parents seemed to accept that he alone was responsible for all three deaths. But they maintained contact with him in prison, visiting and speaking with him on the phone. They are his parents, and despite the horror of what he did, they could not completely abandon him. This complicated love demonstrated how even monsters have people who care about them, though it provided no comfort to those who loved Shanann, Bella, and Cece. In prison, Chris became a subject of fascination for true crime followers. He received letters from people, some condemning him, others bizarrely expressing support or even attraction. He answered some of these letters, engaging with people who wrote to him. These exchanges revealed someone who still seemed disconnected from the gravity of what he had done, speaking about daily prison life as if he were just another inmate serving time. Chris gave interviews from prison to various media outlets and documentary filmmakers. In these interviews, he attempted to explain his actions and his mindset. He spoke about his childhood, his marriage, and the affair. He claimed to have found religion in prison and said he prayed for forgiveness. These interviews were watched by millions, people trying to understand how a seemingly normal person could commit such evil acts. The warning signs that existed before the murders became clear only in hindsight. The financial stress, the affair, Chris's growing distance from Shanann. But thousands of couples experienced these same stresses without anyone being murdered. Friends who knew Chris described him as quiet and nice, not someone who seemed capable of violence. This ordinariness made him more frightening in some ways, suggesting that monsters can hide behind the most mundane facades. Domestic violence experts pointed to the case as an example of why we must take relationship problems seriously. Chris had isolated himself emotionally from Shanann in the weeks before her death. He had been creating a separate life with Nickel. He had been lying to everyone around him. These behaviors, while not necessarily predicting murder, were red flags that the relationship was in crisis. The tragedy was that Shanann never saw the danger she was in. The autopsy reports, when released, provided horrible details about the final moments of Shanann, Bella, and Cece. Shanann had fought for her life, evident from defensive wounds and the fact that she had scratched Chris. Bella had suffered, knowing what was happening and trying to resist. Cece's death had been quicker, but no less cruel. Reading these reports made clear that these were not quick, painless deaths. Chris had watched his wife and children die by his own hands. The oil tanks where Bella and Cece's bodies were found had to be drained to recover them. Workers who were brought in to do this job were traumatized by what they encountered. The bodies had been submerged in crude oil for days, causing extensive decomposition and damage. The process of removing them was difficult and disturbing. These workers, who had no connection to the Watts family, carried the trauma of that recovery with them. Shanann's gravesite at the oil field location became a temporary memorial. People left flowers and notes. Some drove out to the remote location to pay their respects. Eventually, Shanann's body was released to her family, and she was buried in North Carolina near her family. Bella and Cece were buried with their mother, the three of them together. The baby Shanann had been carrying, Nico, was never born, but was remembered in memorials alongside his mother and sisters. The financial aftermath of the murders was complicated. The Watts family home had to be sold, with proceeds going to pay debts and creditors. Shanann's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Chris. Since he was in prison with no assets, the lawsuit was largely symbolic, but it was about holding him accountable in every possible way. Life insurance policies became contentious, with questions about whether Chris could benefit in any way from his crimes. Chris's employer terminated him immediately after his arrest. The company had to deal with the horror that one of their employees had used a work site to dispose of bodies. They cooperated fully with the investigation, providing access to records and locations. The oil tanks where the bodies were found were eventually decommissioned and removed, the site remediated. No one wanted to work at a location associated with such horror. The psychological impact on those who knew the Watts family was profound. Neighbors who had chatted with Chris while he mowed his lawn, who had watched Bella and Cece play in the yard, struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with what he had done. Some moved away, unable to live near the house where the murders occurred. Others stayed, but carried the weight of knowing they had lived next door to a family annihilator. Shanann's friends who had tried to warn her that something was wrong with Chris, who had sensed his growing distance, carried guilt, even though they bore no responsibility. They wondered if they could have done more, said more, somehow prevented what happened. But the truth was that no one could have known what Chris was planning. He had hidden his intentions even from himself until he acted on them. The text messages between Shanann and Chris in the weeks before her death were analyzed extensively. Shanann had sent him long, heartfelt messages about their marriage and her hopes for their future. Chris's responses were brief and cold. He was already emotionally checked out, already planning a future without her. Reading these messages, knowing what would happen, was painful. Seeing Shanann trying so hard to save a marriage with a man who was preparing to kill her. The case raised questions about social media and the performance of perfect family life. Shanann had posted extensively about her family, creating an image of happiness and success. But behind that image, their marriage was failing and they were drowning in debt. Some critics suggested she had been more interested in appearances than reality, but this missed the point. Many people curate their social media presence, showing only the positive while hiding struggles. This is normal human behavior, not a character flaw. Others defended Shanann's social media use as her trying to build a business and support her family. She was a sales representative, and her lifestyle and family were part of her marketing. She was doing what she needed to do to make money. The criticism of her social media presence felt like victim blaming, focusing on her behavior rather than on Chris's choice to murder his family. Shanann had every right to post about her life without it being used against her after her death. The interrogation footage of Chris became widely viewed online. People analyzed his body language, his word choices, his reactions. Body language experts and criminal psychologists offered their interpretations. Most agreed that Chris showed signs of deception throughout his interviews. His affect was flat when it should have been emotional. He made statements that seemed rehearsed. He focused on irrelevant details when asked about his missing family. One particularly chilling moment in the interrogation came when detectives confronted Chris with evidence that contradicted his story. His response was not to come clean, but to dig deeper into his lies. He seemed more concerned with maintaining his deception than with helping find his family. This willingness to continue lying, even when caught, demonstrated a level of narcissism and self-preservation that was striking. The sentencing hearing provided some closure for Shanann's family, but no real comfort. Life in prison without parole meant Chris would never be free, but it didn't bring back Shanann, Bella, or Cece. It didn't erase the horror of how they died. It didn't answer the fundamental question of how a father could kill his children. Justice had been served in a legal sense, but the emotional wound would never fully heal. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Ruzuchek, became advocates for domestic violence awareness. They spoke publicly about warning signs in relationships and the importance of listening when someone says they feel unsafe. They honored their daughter's memory by trying to help others. It was a way to find meaning in tragedy, though nothing could truly compensate for their loss. Chris's confession to police, recorded and later released, showed a man who seemed disconnected from the magnitude of what he had done. Focusing on logistics and timeline rather than the emotional reality, he spoke about positioning bodies and driving routes. He seemed more like someone describing a complicated task he had completed rather than a man who had murdered his family. When asked about what he felt during the murders, Chris struggled to articulate any emotion. He said he felt angry when he killed Shanann, but this seemed like something he thought he should say, rather than a genuine emotional memory. He described killing Bella and Cece as something he had to do, given what he had already done. There was no remorse, no breakdown, no recognition of them as his children whom he should have loved and protected. The question of premeditation became important in understanding Chris's culpability. How long had he been planning this? Was it a decision made in a moment of rage, or had he been thinking about it for days or weeks? Evidence suggested he had been researching and preparing, but the exact timeline was unclear. What was clear was that once he made the decision, he executed it methodically and then tried to cover it up. The affair with Nicole Kessinger was both a motive and a catalyst. Chris wanted to be free to pursue this new relationship, and he saw his family as an obstacle. But the affair alone didn't explain the murders. Many people have affairs and end their marriages without violence. Something in Chris's psychology made him choose murder instead of divorce. That something remained elusive, even after extensive analysis. Financial stress had been crushing the Watts family for years. The bankruptcy, the debt, the struggle to maintain appearances. Chris may have seen divorce as financially ruinous in a way that murder was not. If Shanann simply disappeared, he wouldn't have to split assets or pay child support. This cold calculation, if accurate, made the murders even more heinous. He killed for financial convenience as much as for romantic desire. The impact on the true crime community was significant. The Watts case became one of the most discussed and analyzed cases in recent memory. Every detail was picked apart. Every decision Chris made was scrutinized. The case had video evidence, text messages, social media posts, and eventually a confession. This abundance of material made it compelling for people trying to understand criminal psychology and human behavior. But this intense focus also had negative aspects. Shanann's life was dissected publicly, her marriage and finances examined by strangers, her parenting was questioned, her social media posts were criticized. Some of this analysis crossed the line from seeking understanding to engaging in victim blaming. Shanann deserved to be remembered as a person, not just as a case study. The letters Chris received in prison revealed the strange phenomenon of women being attracted to convicted killers. Some of these letters expressed romantic interest in Chris, despite knowing what he had done. Psychologists call this hybristophilia, attraction to people who have committed crimes. Chris engaged with some of these correspondents, perhaps enjoying the attention or the distraction from his reality. His daily life in prison was mundane and isolated. He worked in the kitchen, attended religious services, and spent most of his time alone in his cell. He had limited contact with other inmates for his own safety, as family killers and child murderers are targeted by other prisoners. Decades stretching ahead with nothing to look forward to. Shanann's brother Frankie Ruzek spoke publicly about his sister and his nieces, keeping their memory alive. He shared photos and stories, reminding people that they were real people who had been loved, not just victims in a crime story. He spoke about Bella's kindness and Cece's energy, about Shanann's strength and determination. He wanted the world to know them as they had been in life. The question of whether Chris showed any signs of being dangerous before the murders was debated extensively. People who knew him described a quiet, passive man who seemed devoted to his family. There were no prior incidents of violence. No one who knew Chris would have predicted he was capable of murder. This made him particularly frightening because it suggested that family annihilators could be anyone, that there were no reliable warning signs. However, domestic violence experts pointed out that emotional abuse and control often precede physical violence. Chris had been lying to Shanann extensively. He had been creating a separate life. He had been withdrawing from the family emotionally. These behaviors, while not predicting murder, were indicators of a relationship in serious trouble. The problem was that these signs were only visible to those inside the relationship. The oil field where the bodies were found became forever associated with the murders. The company that owned the site eventually closed that location. Workers who had been there refused to return. The land itself was marked by the horror that had occurred there. Even after Shanann was buried elsewhere and the oil tanks removed, the site remained a place of darkness in the collective memory. Bella's final moments haunted everyone who learned about them. She had asked her father if what happened to her mother was going to happen to her. She knew. A 4-year-old child understood she was about to be killed by her father. The psychological terror of those moments, on top of the physical act of murder, made what Chris did to Bella particularly cruel. She died afraid and betrayed by the person who should have protected her. Cece, only 3 years old, may not have fully understood what was happening. This was a small mercy in an otherwise merciless crime. But her murder was no less cruel. Chris had held her down and smothered her, watching her die. Then he had pushed her small body into an oil tank. The physical act of doing this to a child, let alone his own child, demonstrated a level of disconnect from human empathy that was hard to comprehend. The unborn baby Nico represented potential and hope that was destroyed along with his mother. Shanann had been excited about this pregnancy. She had announced it to Chris with a special card and gift. He had seemed happy in the video she posted, but within weeks, he had decided to kill her, knowing she was carrying his son. The murder of a pregnant woman added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. Shanann's final text messages showed a woman who had no idea she was in danger. She texted a friend about her conversation with Chris, about trying to work things out. She was hopeful they could save their marriage. She went to sleep that night thinking about the future, about her baby, about her family. She had no way of knowing Chris was planning to kill her. This lack of awareness made her death even more tragic. The Frederick Police Department's handling of the case was examined closely. They had responded quickly to the welfare check and had identified Chris as a suspect within hours. Their interrogation techniques had been effective in getting Chris to reveal inconsistencies in his story. They had processed the crime scene thoroughly and found the bodies quickly. The case was an example of good police work that led to swift justice. The media circus that surrounded the case created additional stress for everyone involved. Reporters camped outside the Watts home. Shanann's family was constantly approached for comments. Chris's parents were hounded for their reactions. The constant attention made grieving privately impossible. Every detail of the case was reported and analyzed, often with little regard for the pain it caused the families involved. The release of discovery materials, including photos, videos, and documents, fueled public interest, but also raised ethical questions. Did the public have a right to see these materials, or should they have remained sealed out of respect for the victims? The decision to release them was based on Colorado's open records laws, but it meant that intimate details of the Watts family's life became public fodder. Documentaries about the case presented different perspectives. Some focused on Shanann and her life, trying to honor her memory. Others focused on Chris and his psychology, attempting to understand what drove him to murder. Netflix produced a documentary that included extensive footage from the case and interviews with law enforcement and people who knew the family. It was watched by millions and reignited public discussion about the murders. The YouTube videos Shanann had posted of her family took on new and painful meaning after the murders. Seeing Chris playing with Bella and Cece, knowing what he would later do to them, was deeply disturbing. Watching Shanann talk excitedly about her pregnancy, unaware she had only weeks to live, broke hearts. These videos became evidence and memorials simultaneously, preserving moments of happiness before everything ended. Chris's transformation and appearance between his arrest and his later interviews was striking. The clean-cut man who had appeared in court looking defeated became someone who looked harder in prison. He grew a beard and appeared to have aged significantly. Whether this reflected internal changes or simply the physical toll of incarceration was unclear, but he looked like a different person than the man who had smiled in family photos. The psychological evaluations conducted on Chris attempted to understand his mental state and capacity for empathy. Some evaluators found him to have narcissistic traits, focusing primarily on his own desires and seeing others as obstacles or tools. Others noted his passive-aggressive tendencies, his inability to express anger or dissatisfaction directly. But none of these evaluations provided a satisfying explanation for why he chose murder instead of divorce. The role of prescription medication in Chris's behavior was debated. He had been on medication for anxiety and depression. Some wondered if these medications or their dosage changes had affected his thinking or impulse control. Medical experts noted that millions of people take similar medications without becoming violent. The medications may have been treating underlying issues, but were not the cause of his actions. Chris's religiosity before and after the murders was examined. He had attended church with Shanann and presented himself as a Christian family man. After his arrest, he claimed to have found genuine faith in prison and to spend his time reading the Bible and praying. Some saw this as authentic spiritual transformation. Others viewed it as another performance, Chris playing the role of repentant sinner, seeking redemption. The economic exploitation of the case by some true crime content creators troubled many observers. YouTube channels and podcasts monetized content about the murders, profiting from tragedy. Some of this content was thoughtful and respectful, genuinely trying to understand what happened. Other content was sensationalized and exploitative, caring more about views and revenue than about the real people involved in the tragedy. Shanann's family had to watch strangers on the internet dissect every aspect of their daughter's life. They saw her criticized for her social media posts, her parenting choices, her financial decisions. They saw people defend Chris or suggest Shanann bore some responsibility for what happened. This secondary victimization through online commentary added to their grief and made healing even more difficult. The children's belongings found in the house after the murders were heartbreaking evidence of lives interrupted. Toys, books, clothes, art projects, the mundane artifacts of childhood that would never be used again. These items were cataloged as evidence, but represented so much more than that. They were reminders of Bella and Cece as real children who had played and laughed and lived. Shanann's wedding ring, left on the nightstand where Chris had removed it from her finger, became a symbol of the marriage's end and of his betrayal. He had taken off her ring after killing her, as if removing this symbol could erase what they had been to each other. This small, cruel gesture demonstrated his desire to move on, to make Shanann and their life together disappear. The timing of the murders, just after Shanann returned from her trip, suggested Chris had been waiting for her to come home to kill her. He could have left her while she was away. He could have texted her and ended the marriage from a distance. Instead, he waited, prepared the house, and murdered her in her own bed. This premeditation made his later claims about acting in a rage ring false. The shallow grave where Shanann was buried showed the haste and lack of planning in Chris's disposal of her body. He had dug it quickly with a shovel from the oil site. He had barely covered her. If not for the cadaver dogs, she might have been found quickly by other means. The grave's shallowness suggested either panic or indifference to whether she was found. The oil tanks where Bella and Cece were found provided better concealment, but required horrific effort to use. Chris had to force their bodies through 8-inch openings at the top of the tanks. He had to manhandle his daughter's bodies, push and shove them into the crude oil. The physical act of doing this was difficult to imagine. What must have been going through his mind as he did this? The community's response to the murders included memorial services, fundraisers for the family, and expressions of collective grief. People who had never met the Watts family felt the impact of the tragedy. It represented a violation of the basic social contract, the expectation that parents protect their children. When a father murders his family, it shakes everyone's sense of safety and order. The legal proceedings were relatively quick because Chris pleaded guilty. There was no trial, no drawn-out process of presenting evidence and hearing witnesses. This was a mercy for Shanann's family, who didn't have to sit through the details of the murders in a courtroom, but it also meant some questions were never fully explored in a public forum. The plea deal traded answers for the certainty of life imprisonment. The death penalty, which prosecutors initially sought, was taken off the table as part of the plea agreement. Some people felt Chris deserved execution for what he had done. Others opposed the death penalty on principle. Shanann's family supported the plea deal because it spared them the ordeal of a trial and guaranteed Chris would never be free. They chose certainty and closure over the possibility of execution. Chris's allocation at sentencing, where he apologized and expressed remorse, was viewed skeptically by most people. He had lied so consistently and thoroughly that his words carried no weight. He said what was expected of him, but there was no evidence of genuine remorse or understanding of the magnitude of what he had done. His apology felt empty and performative. The letters Chris wrote from prison, some of which were made public, revealed someone who seemed to view himself as a victim of circumstances. He wrote about how hard prison was, about missing his freedom. He wrote about finding God and being forgiven, but he rarely wrote about Shanann, Bella, or Cece, except in vague terms. His focus remained primarily on himself and his own experience. The impact on Chris's extended family was complicated. His parents lost their son to prison and lost their grandchildren to murder. They had to grapple with the reality that their son was a monster. They faced judgment and anger from the public. Some family members cut off contact with Chris entirely. Others maintained connection, struggling with the conflict between familial love and moral horror. Shanann's parents maintained their dignity throughout the process. They spoke about their daughter and granddaughters with love. They expressed forgiveness not because Chris deserved it, but because carrying hatred would destroy them. They focused on honoring the memory of those they had lost, rather than on vengeance against the man who had killed them. This grace was extraordinary given their pain. The autopsy photos, though not released to the public, were described in court documents and reports. The descriptions alone were disturbing enough. Shanann's defensive wounds told of her fight for life. The injuries to Bella and Cece confirmed the manner of their deaths. These medical findings removed any doubt about what had happened and confirmed the horror of how they had died. The timeline of events on August 13th was reconstructed to evidence and Chris's eventual confession. Shanann arrived home around 2 a.m. Chris killed her sometime between then and 5 a.m. He then killed the girls and loaded all 3 bodies into his truck. He drove to the oil site, disposed of the bodies, and was back home by late morning. The entire sequence of events took just a few hours. The neighbor's security camera footage became crucial evidence. It showed Chris loading his truck in the early morning hours. While it didn't show the bodies directly, the timing and his behavior were consistent with disposing of evidence. The footage also showed his truck leaving and returning, matching the timeline Chris eventually admitted to. This video evidence made his initial denials impossible to maintain. The text messages between Chris and Nicole in the days before the murders showed a man creating a fantasy future. He texted her about their relationship, made plans to see her, talked about being together. He was living in a fantasy world where his family simply didn't exist or could be made to disappear. These messages revealed his mindset and his motive, even if they didn't predict the specific violence to come. The financial records that showed the Watts family's debt painted a picture of stress and desperation. They were drowning in bills and had very little income. The pressure was immense and constant. But this financial stress, while real, didn't justify murder. Many families face similar challenges without anyone being killed. Chris's choice to murder, rather than to face bankruptcy or divorce, was his alone. Shanann's excitement about her pregnancy, evident in her social media posts and texts to friends, made her death even more tragic. She was planning for the future, picking out names, imagining her growing family. She had no idea that Chris was planning to end that future. The contrast between her hope and his murderous intent was stark and painful. The doctor's appointment Shanann missed on August 13th was supposed to be a regular prenatal checkup. She had been looking forward to it, to seeing how the baby was developing. Her missing this appointment was one of the first red flags that something was wrong. Shanann was conscientious about her health and her pregnancy. She would never have simply skipped this appointment. Nicole Atkinson's persistence in reporting Shanann missing likely saved the investigation. If she had waited longer to call police, Chris might have had more time to establish his story and cover his tracks. Her immediate concern and action put pressure on Chris and led to quick police response. Nicole knew her friend well enough to know something was terribly wrong. The interviews Chris gave after his conviction revealed little genuine insight into his psychology. He seemed to be telling investigators what he thought they wanted to hear, rather than providing real introspection. He spoke about his crimes in detached, clinical terms. He showed no real emotional connection to what he had done or to the people he had killed. The warning signs in the relationship that were missed or ignored became teaching moments for domestic violence educators. The lying, the affair, the financial stress. Individually, these were not predictors of murder, but together, they indicated a relationship in crisis. The lesson was not that anyone could have predicted the murders, but that relationships showing these signs need intervention and support. The prison where Chris was held became his permanent home. He would never leave except in a coffin. The walls of his cell would be the boundaries of his world for the rest of his life. He had no future to look forward to, no hope of freedom. This was the consequence of his choice to murder his family, a living death that would last decades. The photographs of Bella and Cece that circulated after their deaths showed happy, beautiful little girls. Bella with her missing front teeth and big smile. Cece with her infectious energy and joy. These images became how the world remembered them, frozen in childhood innocence. They would never grow up, never go to school, never fall in love, never have families of their own. Shanann's image, similarly frozen in time, showed a vibrant woman with a bright smile. She was 34 when she died, with most of her life still ahead of her. She had dreams and plans. She wanted to grow old with Chris, to raise their children, to build a successful business. All of that was taken from her by the man who had promised to love and protect her. The basement of the Watts home, where Chris claimed to have had his emotional conversation with Shanann about separating, became a focal point of investigation. Was this where he killed her, or was it in the bedroom, as he later admitted? The shifting details of his story made it hard to know what was true. What was certain was that Shanann died in her own home, in a place where she should have been safe. The reaction from the true crime community included both thoughtful analysis and harmful speculation. Some content creators provided careful, respectful coverage of the case. Others engaged in wild theories and baseless accusations. The family had to navigate this landscape, dealing with strangers who felt entitled to have opinions about their tragedy. The letters Chris received from women interested in him romantically were a disturbing aspect of his incarceration. These women knew what he had done, yet they pursued contact with him. Some seemed to believe they could fix him, or that they understood him in ways others didn't. This phenomenon spoke to broader issues about society's fascination with killers and the way some people romanticize violent criminals. Chris's work as a field technician for the oil company had given him access to remote locations and equipment. He had used his job knowledge to dispose of the bodies. His employer had unknowingly provided the means for him to commit and cover up his crimes. The company's cooperation with the investigation was complete, but they had to deal with the horror that their workplace had been used for murder. The social media posts Shanann made about marital problems in the weeks before her death were vague but telling. She shared quotes about fighting for love and not giving up on marriage. She was signaling to her friends that things were difficult, but she maintained hope. She never imagined Chris was beyond saving, that he was planning to kill her. The psychological autopsy attempted on Chris tried to understand his internal world. What had he been thinking in the days and hours before the murders? Did he feel guilt or hesitation? Did he plan every detail or act impulsively? The truth seemed to be somewhere in between. He had been thinking about killing his family for some time, but the specific execution may have been less planned than it appeared. The moment when Bella asked if what happened to her mother was going to happen to her became the most haunting detail of the entire case. It revealed that she understood she was going to die. She was looking at her father, the person who was supposed to protect her, and she knew he was going to kill her. The psychological trauma of those final moments, on top of the physical act of murder, was almost unbearable to contemplate. The oil tanks themselves became symbols of the crime's horror. The idea that Chris had stuffed his daughter's bodies into these industrial containers, submerging them in crude oil, seemed almost medieval in its cruelty. The tanks had to be completely drained and cleaned after the bodies were recovered. Workers involved in this process described it as the most difficult thing they had ever done. The difference between Chris's public persona and his private reality was stark. Publicly, he was a devoted family man who posted pictures with his daughters and supported his wife's business. Privately, he was having an affair and planning to murder his family. This duality made people question whether they could ever really know someone, even those closest to them. The text message Shanann sent Chris from the plane on her way home, saying she missed him and loved him, was particularly painful to read, knowing what would happen hours later. She was reaching out to her husband, trying to connect, having no idea he was preparing to kill her. The one-sided nature of their emotional connection in those final days was heartbreaking. The investigation revealed that Chris had been planning his exit from the marriage for weeks. He had been looking at apartments. He had been calculating finances. He had been imagining a life with Nicole. But somewhere along the way, planning to leave had transformed into planning to kill. That transformation was where Chris's evil truly revealed itself. The victim impact statements at sentencing gave voice to the pain the murders had caused. Shanann's family spoke about their loss. Friends described the impact on their lives. Even strangers who had followed the case spoke about how it had affected them. The ripples of Chris's violence extended far beyond his immediate victims. The question of whether Chris should have been given the death penalty remained debated. Those who supported it argued that the murder of children, especially by a parent, warranted the ultimate punishment. Those who opposed it cited moral objections to state execution. The plea deal that resulted in life sentences satisfied neither side completely, but provided certainty. The interrogation techniques used by police on Chris were studied by law enforcement professionals. The detectives had built rapport while simultaneously confronting him with evidence. They had given him opportunities to confess while making clear they knew he was lying. Their approach had been effective in getting Chris to eventually admit his guilt, even if his initial confession was filled with lies. The role of social media in the investigation was significant. Shanann's posts provided a timeline of events and insights into the family's life. Chris's internet searches revealed his planning and his interests. Messages between Chris and Nicole showed the affair. Digital evidence was crucial to building the case against Chris. The community of Frederick held vigils and memorial services for Shanann, Bella, and Cece. Local residents, many of whom had never met the family, came together to mourn and support each other. The murders had violated their sense of safety and community. Coming together was a way to process that violation and to honor the victims. The sale of the Watts home was handled quietly and quickly. No one wanted to live in a place where such horror had occurred. The buyers who eventually purchased it did so at a reduced price and with full knowledge of its history. They gutted and renovated the interior, trying to create a new space from the bones of tragedy. Chris's letters from prison to his parents revealed his attempts to maintain their relationship. He wrote about daily life in prison, about his religious activities, about missing them. He seemed to want to be seen as their son still, not just as a murderer. His parents' continued contact with him showed the complicated nature of familial love, even in the face of unforgivable acts. The debate about whether Chris could ever be genuinely remorseful continued among psychologists and criminologists who studied the case. Some believed his religious conversion and expressions of guilt might be authentic. Others saw him as fundamentally lacking in empathy, and therefore incapable of true remorse. The truth might be that even Chris didn't fully understand his own emotional state. The impact on Nicole Kessinger's life was severe. She had been unknowingly involved with a man who was murdering his family. The public backlash against her was intense, with some people blaming her for the murders, even though she had no knowledge of Chris's plans. She was forced to change her identity and disappear from public view to escape the association with the crime. The decision by prosecutors to offer a plea deal rather than seek a trial was pragmatic. The evidence was strong, but trials are unpredictable. The plea deal guaranteed 3 life sentences and spared Shanann's family the trauma of a trial. It also avoided the years of appeals that would have followed a death sentence. The public's intense interest in the case reflected broader cultural fascinations with family annihilators and domestic violence. Why would a parent kill their children? How could a marriage go so wrong? These questions resonated because they touched on fundamental fears about trust and safety. If Chris Watts could murder his family, what did that say about anyone's ability to trust their intimate partners? The psychiatric evaluations of Chris attempted to categorize him diagnostically. Terms like narcissism, psychopathy, and antisocial personality disorder were discussed. But no diagnosis fully explained what he had done. He was a person who made a choice, and that choice was to murder 3 people. The psychological language provided framework, but not absolution. The home security footage from neighbors became a cautionary tale about surveillance and privacy. The video that helped convict Chris also raised questions about how much of our lives is recorded without our knowledge. The footage had been crucial to the investigation, but it also meant the Watts family's final hours had been partially documented without their consent or awareness. The months between the murders and Chris's conviction were difficult for Shanann's family. They were grieving while also dealing with media attention and the legal process. They had to hear Chris's lies about Shanann killing the girls. They had to see him on television playing the concerned husband. The relief when he finally confessed and pleaded guilty was mixed with the ongoing pain of loss. The transformation of the case from a missing persons investigation to a triple homicide case happened quickly. Within days, police had found the bodies and arrested Chris. The speed of the investigation was both a blessing and a curse. It brought quick justice, but also meant the horror was revealed rapidly, giving the family no time to prepare emotionally. The oil field location where the bodies were found became notorious. True crime enthusiasts visited the site, taking photos and making videos. This tourism of tragedy troubled law enforcement and the family. Eventually, access to the site was restricted, but the damage to its reputation and the memory of what happened there remained. The role of gender in public reaction to the case was notable. Chris was universally condemned, as he should have been, but Shanann faced criticism from some quarters for her social media use, her parenting style, and her business activities. This double standard, where male perpetrators and female victims are both scrutinized but in different ways, reflected broader societal issues. The letters written to Chris in prison included both hate mail and love letters. Some people wrote to condemn him, to make sure he knew how much he was hated. Others wrote to express romantic or friendly interest. Both types of letters spoke to the public's complex relationship with notorious criminals. The fascination mixed with revulsion. The Chris Watts case remains one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in recent American history. The combination of premeditation, the victims' young ages, and Chris's attempts to deceive investigators made it particularly shocking. The case challenged assumptions about family safety and parental protection, forcing people to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest danger comes from within the family itself. Years after the murders, Chris remains in prison with no possibility of release. He will grow old behind bars, decades stretching ahead, with nothing but time to reflect on what he has done. Whether he truly comprehends the magnitude of his crimes or feels genuine remorse remains questionable. His interviews and letters suggest someone still primarily focused on himself, rather than on his victims. Shanann, Bella, and Cece are gone, their lives cut short by the person who should have loved and protected them most. Shanann never got to meet her son Nico, or watch her daughters grow up. Bella never got to lose more baby teeth or start kindergarten. Cece never got to turn 4. The loss of their future is the tragedy that cannot be measured or quantified. The impact on those who love them continues. Shanann's parents carry their grief daily. Her brother mourns his sister and nieces. Friends remember her energy and drive. The hole left by their absence is permanent. No amount of justice can fill that hole or bring them back. The best that can be done is to remember them, to honor their lives, and to ensure they are more than just victims in a crime story. The lessons from the case are difficult and uncomfortable. Domestic violence can escalate in unexpected ways. Financial stress can create dangerous situations. Affairs can lead to family destruction. But most importantly, evil can hide behind ordinary faces. Chris Watts looked like everyone's neighbor, like a normal dad and husband. This ordinariness was what made him so dangerous and what makes the case so disturbing. Shanann's social media presence, once a celebration of family life, became a memorial and a warning. Her posts showed a woman building a life, trying to succeed in business, loving her children. They also showed the gap between public presentation and private reality. This duality is not unique to Shanann, but is part of modern life for many families navigating social media. The Frederick community, forever marked by these murders, has tried to move forward while honoring the memory of the victims. The neighborhood where the Watts family lived looks the same, but everyone who lives there knows what happened. The community found ways to remember while also trying to heal from the violation of their sense of safety. The legacy of Shanann Watts should be defined by how she lived. She was a devoted mother who loved her daughters fiercely. She was an ambitious woman trying to build a successful business. She was a friend who was loved by many. She was a daughter and sister who was cherished. She deserved to live, to see her children grow, to meet her son. Chris Watts took all of that away in a few hours of violence, leaving behind only memory and pain.